Shadow Slave. By Guiltythree. Chapter 13-17, Difficult Questions. Approaching the window, Sunny opened the heavy shutters and looked at the desolate landscape of Weave from the height of one of the Nightmare Spell Temple's bell towers. The sky was veiled in impenetrable darkness. The waters flowing through the canals of the floating city glowed with iridescent radiance, bathing the empty streets in ethereal glow. Usually, the light of the great river at night was dreamlike and beautiful, but contrasted against the forlorn desolation of Weave, it made for an eerie sight. It was like a city of ghosts. He sighed, thinking about the cruel fate that had befallen the followers of Weaver. And the creature that had driven them to extinction. The Mad Prince. A dark expression appeared on Sunny's face. He was reluctant to think about his meeting with the defiled Titan, or at least some vestige of the abhorrent creature that had found its way into his dreams. It almost felt as though thinking about the abomination would summon it here. Nevertheless, Sunny had to consider what he had seen, and heard, in the harrowing dream. Because it was too ominous. I dreamt of being Weaver. The spider with a broken leg was, without a doubt, a representation of the demon of fate. It was not surprising that Sunny had dreamt of the nebulous daemon after witnessing the mural in the grand hall of the temple, and neither was it unexpected that he had assumed the daemon's role in his nightmare. Weaver's blood was running through Sunny's veins, after all, and he too had an innate affinity to fate. The latter was the reason for the former. In the end, it was because of being fated that he had stumbled on the egg of the loathsome thieving bird and received the forbidden lineage of the sinister daemon. Sinister. Sunny had actually never thought about Weaver in such terms before. Mostly because he had benefited greatly from their tenuous connection, but also because there was no reason to. In all honesty, he had admired the mysterious daemon, with no particular reason except for the fact that the demon of fate was an intelligent, cunning, and fearsome deity. But the more Sunny learned about the end of the dream realm and the nightmare spell, the more ominous of a figure Weaver seemed. And how could they not? Who could be more dangerous than a creature that wielded knowledge of fate itself? Sunny and Nephi's had argued about the nature of the spell, whether it was a fundamentally benevolent force or not. He was inclined to believe that it had been created for a noble purpose. Which was not to say that it was not a vile and terrible curse for the humans of the waking world. But he was also starting to suspect that neither of them really understood the true intention and scope of what Weaver had done at all. The nightmare spell seemed like a tool to make living beings stronger in the face of encroaching corruption. But there were too many discrepancies between what was apparent and what was hidden beneath the surface. The nightmares, the slow but inevitable escalation, the sheer convenience of it all. What was Weaver's true goal? How had the rudimentary version of the spell Anank wielded grown to become the pervasive and nearly omnipotent power that seemed to be as absolute as the universal laws of reality that the gods established? Come to think of it, how had the Doom War ended? What had actually happened to the demons, the gods? And Weaver? Where did the corruption that had devoured the dream realm come from, and why? Just like always, Sunny had no answers. More than that, these were not even the questions he had to ponder. The defilement was a form of corruption that had spread from the estuary, and there were 6 champions of it. Dread Lord, Devouring Beast, Undying Slaughter, Torment, Soul Stealer. And Mad Prince. The Mad Prince, who seemed strangely familiar when Sunny had dreamt of him. He shivered. Why did he feel familiar? The defiled horror seemed like a human. No, like a broken marionette of a human. He was like a flesh puppet worn by a boundless sea of madness, to the point where the madness seemed like the actual being, while the human body just seemed like its ragged shell. Sunny still shuddered when he remembered the creature's eyes. The torment hiding in them was like a chilling storm of insanity born from 1,000 years of horror, agony, and knowledge. Knowledge was the heaviest thing in the world, after all. As well as the origin of power. And that was why he was very uncomfortable with the fact that the Mad Prince seemed so familiar. Sunny had not noticed it at the start, because the abominable creature was too different from him. But when the sin of Solace appeared, he had to admit to himself that the defiled Titan and the Sword Wraith were eerily similar. Which meant that Sunny and the Mad Prince were similar, too. He stared at the ghostly landscape of Weave for a while. Have I assumed the role of that abomination? Sunny and Nephi's had discussed how strange their entry into the nightmare was. Whose roles did they assume? Who could have been present that far upstream at the moment of their arrival? He had also theorized that the Mad Prince might have died there, as evident by the piece of flotsam with deranged runes carved into it. It was strange to think that a corrupted titan could have become an ascended tyrant. But not impossible. The spell could have decided that it was the best and only option, slightly changing the rules. The third nightmare was different from the previous two, to begin with challengers entering it with their own bodies. That was one possibility. The other, more harrowing possibility, was that the abominable madman could have been the sin of Solace from the future, conjured into the present by some strange quirk of the great river. Anank had said it herself that the flow of time in the tomb of Ariel was often strange and unpredictable. The Mad Prince could also have been the future version of Sunny, who had either been devoured by the corruption or the sin of Solace itself. No. No way. No way. He suddenly felt incredibly cold. But it was too compelling of a theory to be discarded because of the outrage he felt at the thought of being able to turn into that bastard. The letters of the modern alphabet being mixed with the deranged runes, the ability to spread madness, the physical resemblance. It was not only the Mad Prince, either. The description of the rest of the 6 plagues was also extremely ominous. The Soul Stealer, who could wear the skin of those he killed. The Undying Slaughter, who was overcome by insatiable bloodlust. The Devouring Beast, who consumed the bodies of her slain foes. The Dread Lord, and Torment. Didn't they sound like corrupted, twisted versions of the members of the cohort? All except Nephi's, who was incorruptible. It's too ridiculous of a thought. Sunny could reluctantly acknowledge that some form of time distortion could have happened inside the tomb of Ariel. He could even admit that it was quite possible for them to fail in conquering the nightmare and succumb to corruption. However, what were the chances of all of them surviving that and becoming saints in the process? The 6 plagues were vastly more powerful than the members of the cohort, to the point that an entire civilization of powerful awakened had not managed to slay a single one of them. 2 civilizations, even, considering the King of Twilight and his people. No, it was far more likely that Nephi's and her cohort were pitted against nightmare creature resembling the perverse versions of themselves because of a little nudge from the spell. The spell had shown itself to be fond of such ghastly, but poetic twists of fate, after all. Still, how had the runes of the waking world language ended up on the piece of flotsam? Sunny remained motionless for a long time, looking at the desolate expanse of weave. Eventually, the glowing waters dimmed, and the 7 suns emerged from the river. Sunny sensed the shadows move in the adjacent rooms, telling him that Anank and Nephi's had woken up. He closed his eyes for a few long moments. Trying to chase away the heavy thoughts, he then dismissed Saint and Imp. It was time to meet the new day. Hopefully, he would get some answers after reaching Fallen Grace. I need to strengthen Nightmare as soon as possible. The Mad Prince had invaded his dreams once, and there was no guarantee that it would not happen again. Sunny needed to protect himself while he slept, and since helping the Black Stallion evolve was also the only way for him to strengthen himself in the short term, he could achieve both goals at once that way. I'm going to have to craft some memories. Luckily, with the Crown of Twilight supplying him with essence, weaving strings of it to create memories would not be as taxing and long of a process as it had been before. Thinking about how many soul shards he had and what memories to create, Sunny rubbed his face and went outside to meet his companions. They were going to leave Weave soon. Chapter 13:18, Leaving Weave. Sunny, Nephi's, and Anank spent several days in the Temple of the Nightmare Spell, resting and exploring the forlorn city as they prepared for the last leg of the journey. These days were strangely tranquil and peaceful, but also bittersweet. It was because the 3 of them knew that their time together was coming to an end. The young priestess, who had been their caretaker and guide for the last few weeks, was not going to be able to follow her wards to where they needed to go. Fallen Grace, the city of dusk, lay far beyond the boundary of where she was allowed to exist. Such was the fate of all Riverborn. Sunny and Nephi's were both painfully aware of what awaited Anank in the future. That was why, even though they tried to hide their emotions, a dark shadow was cast over their hearts. The young priestess herself, meanwhile, seemed at peace with her bitter fate. An easy smile often appeared on her lips, and she fully dedicated herself to making preparations to send the 2 of them on their way. Sunny and Nephi's were going to have to travel far downstream on their own. They needed supplies and knowledge to reach Fallen Grace without Anank, so she was busy making sure they would have everything they needed. They gathered various resources from all over the desolate ruins of Weave. The young priestess also taught them how to navigate the great river and recognize various perils hiding in its depths. Nephi's continued to learn how to steer the enchanted ketch, while Sunny spent his time weaving threads of shadow essence and studying the estuary key. Eventually, there was nothing left for them in the orphan city. As the beautiful light of the 7 rising suns suffused the cool morning air, Anank led them through the empty streets for the last time and jumped lightly onto the deck of the graceful ketch. Come. We will sail downstream today. Sunny and Nephi's glanced at each other, then silently followed her aboard the boat. The young priestess watched them with a smile, then nodded and gestured to the steering oar. My lady, it is best if you practice steering while I am still with you. Remember our lessons. You can surely succeed. Nephi's looked at her for a while, her face motionless. She hesitated a little before sitting down on the helmsman's bench and taking the oar. Sunny, meanwhile, frowned. Wait. What about you? If we are going to sail away on the ketch, how are you going to get back to Weave? Anank shook her head. We stretches far downstream, just like it does upstream. There are several island ships we will visit before it is time for me to turn back. I will leave you at the lower house of parting, where there are other vessels for me to use. He hesitated for a few moments, then nodded reluctantly. Sunny had not come to terms with how they would have to leave Anank behind, still. But there was nothing he could do, and nothing he knew how to say. They had no other choice. But the farewell was not upon them yet. Perhaps he would be able to find the correct words in the days to come. With a sigh, Sunny lowered himself to the deck. Usually, Anank would sit on the bench at the stern of the ketch, while Nephi's would be opposite him at the middle point of the deck. Today, however, their familiar positions were reversed. Neph was holding the steering oar, while the priestess sat down near Sunny. He had grown somewhat accustomed to how beautiful the young Anank was, but looking at her directly still felt strange. Especially because of how bright her smile was, and how heavy his heart was. Thank you, my lord. Sunny looked at her somberly, surprised. Me. For what? The young priestess sighed lightly, then looked at the desolate landscape of Weave with a wistful expression. For wanting to learn about my birthplace so much. I am glad to have shared its stories with someone. Very much. He lowered his head and remained silent for a few moments. Sure. No problem. At that moment, Nephi's took a deep breath, and then said something in a resolute voice. The word that escaped her lips echoed from the walls of the canal, and a subtle ripple spread across the surface of the flowing water. It was as though the word itself contained an invisible power capable of reshaping the world. Soon, a strong gale rose, filling the sails of the old ketch. It was both similar and different from how Anank summoned the wind. Neph's shaping was more direct and crude, lacking stability. But, at the same time, it contained a wild and fearsome will. As a result, the gale summoned by the true name of the wind was able to propel the boat forward despite not being as strong as what the young priestess had been able to call upon. The word they spoke was the same, but the result differed. It was because of the nature of the sorcery of names. Unlike other types of sorcery, which acted through fixed conduits like essence threads and runes, it used the shapers themselves as the conduit. Nephi's was of a lower rank than Anank, so she couldn't channel the power of the word as potently. But, at the same time, her body and soul were aflame with the divine lineage of Sun God. And more importantly, she possessed a true name of her own. Those with true names were connected to the mystical side of the world much closer, would be influenced by the hidden powers of the world much more. And be able to exert greater influence in turn. Which was why Nephi's was able to control the ketch with a sufficient level of power despite not being a saint like Anank. You are doing great, my lady. Speak the names of concealment next. Neph lingered, her face a little pale. The sorcery of names did not come without a cost, just like the other types of sorcery. Channeling a word put a strain on the shaper's body, as while uttering it did not consume essence, controlling the outcome did. Eventually, she gritted her teeth and said the rest of the names the priestess had taught her, arranging them into a phrase. The ketch flew through the canals. Soon, it broke free of the city boundaries and sped into the open expanse of the great river, leaving the forlorn city behind. They were once again traveling downstream, deeper into the past. Chapter 13:19, House of Youth. The next morning, they reached the first of the remote island ships Anank had told them about. It slowly appeared from beyond the horizon, illuminated by the dreamlike sunlight. This one was different from the house of parting. The artificial island was much larger, and instead of a solemn and solitary building, it encompassed a whole district. There were many houses, gardens, and water features, all of them bright and colorful. Despite the same desolation that reigned weave, this place seemed strangely festive. It was easy to imagine how full of vitality it had once been. Anank's eyes glistened with nostalgia. She smiled softly and said, her voice melodious, "This is the House of Youth." Sunny and Nephi's looked at the bright island ship, wondering what its purpose was. The sight of it was a little uplifting, and a little sad. Contrasted against the beautiful atmosphere, the emptiness seemed even more poignant. The young priestess sighed. This is one of the 7 houses that Riverborn spent their childhood and adolescence at. She lingered for a moment, and then explained, as you can imagine, children grow up differently here on the Great River. From the moment they are born, their bodies are beholden to the currents of its time. If brought upstream, they will swiftly reach adulthood. At the same time, their parents will have to grow older if they wish to remain with their child. In a span of a few generations, families will be torn apart, and a city will be broken into pieces. Anank shook her head. Of course, it is also cruel to thrust a child into adulthood while their mind remains immature. So, the 7 houses exist. Actually, it is a bit strange for me to explain these things, since that is just how life in the tomb of Ariel is. To me, it is the manner in which outsiders grow up that seems odd. She laughed. I couldn't believe my mother when she told me that kids outside just grow up inevitably, while remaining in the same place, and have no choice on when to become adults. How scary. Can you imagine? Sunny and Nephi's looked at each other, befuddled. After a while, he cleared his throat. Yeah, I can easily imagine. But, wait. What is the exact purpose of these 7 houses? Fallen Grace was most likely built in the same way, so it would be good to know. Plus, he was simply curious. The young priestess smiled. It is simple, really. When a man and a woman decide to have a child, they travel downstream, to the house of birth. The children are born and spend the first months of their lives there. She looked at the waters of the great river and added, her voice wistful, as the mind of the child matures, they and their parents travel upstream to the next house, where the kids become toddlers. After a year or 2, the family travels to the 3rd house, and so forth. This way, kids have a chance to have proper childhoods. It is a happy time for the families, and moving on to the next house is a big event for the children, akin to the birthday ceremony you outsiders have. Sunny lingered for a few moments, then nodded. The river people did not have the same perception of time as the rest of humans. They still counted time in months and years, but these measurements were simply traditions brought into the tomb of Ariel by those who had come from the outside. Although there were something akin to seasonal changes within the tomb of Ariel, the idea of a solar year was meaningless here. So, the children growing up on the Great River would put much more meaning into traveling upstream and getting an older body than into an empty thing like getting older by an imaginary year. Especially since their lives were not limited by the dwindling number of years that remained before they grew old and died. Anank noticed his contemplative expression and added, this last house, the House of Youth, is where our bodies reach the stage of the cusp of adulthood. The parents usually leave for the main city and leave the kids with other youths. Yet different kids reach mental maturity at different paces. Some spend just a few years here before moving on to reunite with their families. Some stay longer. Some lazy rascals even refuse to become adults for decades. Her cheeks turned slightly pink. I might have been one of those rascals myself. Sunny smiled, imagining the dignified and wise elderly woman he knew avoiding the responsibilities of adulthood for as long as she could, getting into all kinds of mischief with the other young Riverborn. Had Anank really been such an unruly troublemaker once? He shook his head. But wait. If that is true, then how would these youths have families of their own? They would turn into infants by traveling to the house of birth, no. Anank nodded. Indeed. That is why the whole city migrates some distance upstream each generation. That gives the young ones a chance to have children of their own. Of course, it also means that their parents grow a little older with each migration. But our lifespans are long. The future is more forgiving than the past. The eldest ones assume guidance roles in the 7 houses, as well. She remained silent for a few moments. Nevertheless, a city might reach a point where the older part of its population would not be able to migrate anymore. That never happened to Weave, since many died in the battles against the corrupted, and those who survived too long usually chose to leave from the House of Parting. Our history also does not stretch that far. But downstream, where the great cities of Sibyls used to be, that was how new settlements were created. The young split off to start life anew. Sunny and Nephi's remained silent, thinking about how bizarre the civilization of the Great River was, after all. The way of life of the river people was indeed completely different from the outside world. Even simple things like parenthood, childhood, and growing up were entirely unlike what they knew. Life always finds a way. Which was why it was even sadder to see it destroyed, how it had been here in Weave. Anank sighed. There had been a single migration after I left the House of Youth. So, I will be able to guide you past all the 7 houses, to the House of Parting far downstream. It should not take us more than a few days. With that, she turned to Nephi's and smiled. In the meantime, my lady, I will help you grow accustomed to controlling the catch. As she and Neph talked, Sunny looked at the bright buildings of the House of Youth, which were drawing closer and closer. And then slowly drifting past. He was thinking about what Anank's childhood must have looked like, as well as about the bleak and cold childhood of his own. Wasn't it funny? The young priestess, who had been born in a tomb built by the demon of dread from the corpse of an unholy titan, clung desperately to her childhood, not wanting to become an adult. While he, who had been born in the waking world, couldn't wait to leave that bitter page of his life behind. And in the end, they had both ended up in this catch together. Sunny sighed. It would be nice if the kids of the future, the waking world's future, could live like her, and not like me. That was such a strange thought.